Hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, hello, and welcome back to Granola God. ASMR. You may already have heard some background noise because I share an apartment with other people, and that's life. But I want to get started with the concept of this video as soon as I can because I don't have a ton of space on my phone at this current moment, which is the equipment I'm working with here. And tonight I'm going to be returning to a book which I've previously read. That book is none other than Haunted America. Haunted America. Now, if you watched the last video I did where I read this book, then you'll know that this book contains some ghost stories, some real ghost stories from America, throughout American history. And last time, I just read a few selections from it, and I'm going to do the same tonight. So, I've already picked out a few stories to read. And let's try to read as many as we can with the available time. I also want to say hello to my new subscribers. We just went over 300. 300, which is actually crazy. So thank you so much for supporting the channel. And hopefully if you're new, you're already aware that I make some paranormal ASMR content, and I would like to keep making more because I really enjoy consuming that content. So please let me know if you're a new subscriber, if this is something that you're into. And other than that, let's jump into the stories. Let me see, I've marked a couple of them for today. The first story in this lovely book that I'm going to read to you tonight is called Stalked by an Invisible Entity. In November 1988, Jackie Hernandez moved into a small house on 11th Street in San Pedro, California. She was looking to make a fresh start, but her hopefulness quickly turned into what she described as the nightmare of all nightmares. Dun, dun, dun. As soon as Jackie moved into her new place, she felt a presence in the house. At first, it made her feel safe, like someone was looking out for her. But Jackie soon realized that group first visited Jackie's house, they noticed a foul odor in the home, heard noises in the attic, and captured glowing orbs of light in photos. But they were skeptical of Jackie's claim that she'd seen a phantom head in the attic, so Jeff took several photos in the darkened space. He left the room in terror after an unseen force yanked the camera from his hands. When he gathered up the courage to go back into the attic, this time with a flashlight, he found part of the camera on one side of the room and the lens on the other, inside a box. Later that same evening, while Jeff and Barry were in the attic, Jeff was violently pushed by an invisible hand. After they returned to the main level of the house, loud banging noises were heard coming from the attic, as if someone or something was stomping above them. When the researchers returned to the house later that month, they saw a liquid oozing from the walls and dripping from the cabinets. They took samples of it to a lab, which they concluded that the substance was human blood. Why it was oozing from the walls was anyone's guess. Girl, did this really happen to her? This is not okay. I guess not to her, but to the investigators. Get out and don't look back. On September 4th. Also, I just want to say, I'm not telling you that. There are little subtitles in this book, as you can see. Get out and don't look back. And also, that's makeup, not dirt on my fingers, so don't get it twisted. On September 4th, the poltergeist ramped up its attention-seeking behavior. After watching objects fly through the air and hearing strange moaning and breathing noises, Jackie called the researchers for help. Jeff and Gary Boehm, Barry Conrad's friend, were inspecting the pitch-black attic. They were just about to leave when Jeff screamed. Gary took a photo, hoping that the flash would light up the room so he could see Jeff and help him. Gary's photo captured the spirit's latest attack on Jeff. He was hanging from the rafters with a clothesline wrapped around his neck. The cord was tied with a seaman's knot. Gary was able to rescue Jeff, who was terribly shaken by his encounter with the evil entity that seemed to be out to get him. After experiencing a lot of other paranormal phenomena that night, Jackie and the other researchers left the San Pedro house, never to return. You can run, but you can't hide. Frightened for the safety of her young children, Jackie moved her family nearly 200 miles away to Weldon, California. But it didn't take long for the poltergeist to find her. The haunting started with strange scratching noises in a backyard shed. Then a black, shapeless form was spotted in the hallway of the house. And while moving an old television set out of the storage shed, Jackie's neighbors saw the ghostly image of an old man on the screen. In April 1990, when the researchers heard that the paranormal activity had followed Jackie to her new home, they drove there to continue working on the case. Besides, Jeff Wheatcraft had a personal interest in the matter. He wanted to know why the entity was focusing its physical attacks on him. That night, Jackie, her friend, and the investigators decided to use also said that his killer had lived in Jackie's former home in San Pedro. When Jeff asked the spirit why he was being targeted, the entity said that he looked like his killer. Ew. Then the evil spirit picked up Jeff and threw him against the wall. Naturally, he was frightened, but he was not injured. Later, Barry Conrad searched old newspaper records and found out that what the spirit said was true. In 1930, sailor Herman Hendrickson was found drowned in San Pedro Bay. Although he'd also suffered a fractured skull, his death was ruled accidental. Perhaps Herman's spirit was trying to tell them that he was really murdered. Spirit Stalker. In June 1990, Jackie moved back to San Pedro and rented an apartment on 7th Street. This time she had a priest bless the place before she moved in. Even so, the glowing orbs of light returned. Later that year, Barry Conrad's home was also tormented by poltergeist activity. Objects were mysteriously moved to new locations. Burners on the gas stove turned on by themselves, and a broom was left standing on top of the stove. Scissors flew across the kitchen and were also found underneath pillows in the bedroom. Jeff Wheatcraft was again pushed by the invisible force, which left red scratch marks on his back. The haunting subsided after that, but other residents of the house on 11th Street in San Pedro also claimed to experience poltergeist activity. Since then, it is said that no one has lived in the house for more than 6 months. And that is Jackie's story, I believe. The next story that I have marked is called Samuel Clemens's Psychic Tree. One night in the late 1850s, Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, woke up clutching the sheets on his bed. His palms were sweaty and his heart was pounding. It had been so real, he thought, so vivid. Was it really just a dream, or did it actually happen? Before he was a world-renowned author and humorist enough as Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens worked as an apprentice boat pilot on the Pennsylvania. His younger brother Henry also worked on the vessel as a mud clerk, a hard and dreary job that was barely one step above being a servant. But Henry stuck with it, perhaps tempted by the possibility of a promotion to a superior position on the steamboat. While the ship was docked in St. Louis, Samuel stayed with his sister and brother-in-law who lived in town. Henry often dropped by to visit before returning to his shipboard duties. During a visit in May 1858, Henry was unusually quiet as he prepared to return to the Pennsylvania. It was not like him to be so somber. Did that really just happen? That night, Samuel saw images in a dream that was frighteningly realistic. He saw Henry lying in a coffin that was balanced on 2 chairs in the living room of their sister's house. Henry was wearing a suit of Samuel's, and in his hands, which were folded on his chest, he held a bouquet of white roses with one red rose in the middle. When Samuel awoke, he didn't know whether he had just had a dream or if he was recalling actual events. Unfortunately, on the trip downriver, Samuel got into an argument with the owner of the steamer and was fired. Henry remained on board. A nightmare becomes reality. Several days later, the Pennsylvania left on its return trip to St. Louis. As it approached Memphis, the boat's boilers exploded with a deafening roar. Dozens of people on board were killed and wounded. Samuel heard about the horrible accident and quickly made his way to Memphis. He searched high and low for Henry until he found him on a mattress in a warehouse that had been turned into a hospital to treat the accident victims. Henry had inhaled red-hot steam and was not expected to live, but somehow he fought back, and his condition slowly improved. Okay, maybe he's not gonna die. One night, the agonizing screams of those in the makeshift hospital were getting the best of Henry, so a doctor ordered a small dose of medicine to help him sleep. But the person who administered the drug gave Henry too much. It caused him to overdose, and he died before morning broke. Henry's body was dressed in one of Samuel's suits, placed in a coffin, and displayed in a viewing room at the makeshift hospital. As Samuel was mourning near his brother's casket, a woman placed a bouquet of white roses with one red rose in the center in his dead brother's hands. Samuel was stunned. His chilling dream, or rather nightmare, had come true. Henry's coffin was sent to his sister's house in St. Louis. Samuel arrived just before the casket was placed in the living room, where two chairs sat spaced apart waiting to receive it. It was the final detail of Samuel's psychic dream come true. That was technically the end of the story, but there's a little note at the end. A little note. And it says, Samuel Clemens was so deeply affected by his prophetic dream that foreshadowed his brother's death that 24 years later, he joined the Society for Psychical Research, a British group of supporters of paranormal studies. Okay, Mark Twain. That's really interesting. I never knew Mark Twain had, like, paranormal experiences. Next. The next story is going to be dark. I just want to give, like, a content warning for this, actually. Besides the general violence and intense things that go on in a lot of these stories. Sorry if I'm scratching my nose, but this story is going to talk about violence against enslaved people in the 1800s in America. So I just want to say that because it is, like, kind of a darker theme, so I want to get that out of the way before I start the story. That being said, maybe you've heard of this one before. This story is called The Tortured Souls of the LaLaurie Mansion. In the early 1800s, Marie Delphine LaLaurie was the creme de la creme of the high society of New Orleans. Rich, pretty, and intelligent, she put nearly everyone social butterflies. Marie was born in Louisiana around 1775. She was widowed twice and had 5 children before marrying Dr. Leonard Lewis LaLaurie in 1825. In the early 1830s, Marie and her husband moved into the stunning 3-story mansion at 1140 Royal Street in New Orleans. It was one of the finest houses in the city. The home also reflected their social status because the family was noted for its wealth and prominence in the community. As visible members of New Orleans society, the Lauries often hosted grand parties that were attended by the city's most influential citizens. Like many wealthy people of the time, the Lauries owned several slaves who cooked, cleaned, and maintained the property. Many guests remembered the finely dressed servants who took care of their every need. But other LaLaurie slaves, sometimes glimpsed in passing, were surprisingly thin and hollow-chested. Rumors began to circulate that Marie LaLaurie was far from kind to her servants. I just want to pause and say that I don't think any slave owner in the 1800s was kind to enslaved people, right? Anyway, just want to call out some of the weird things in this book sometimes. But scary stories of ghosts are still interesting. One neighbor claimed that he watched in horror as Marie chased a terrified female slave with a whip. The girl eventually made it to the roof of the mansion, where she chose to jump to her death rather than face her enraged owner's maniacal abuse. What happened to the girl's body remains a mystery. Some accounts say that it was buried on the property, while others report that it was dumped in an abandoned well. A fire reveals all. The true extent of Marie LaLaurie's revolting cruelty was finally revealed in April 1834, when a fire broke out in the mansion. As the story goes, the blaze was set by a cook who simply couldn't handle any more of Marie LaLaurie's torture. I was getting a lot of neck pain, so I had to adjust how I was sitting. Okay. As the fire swept through the house and smoke filled the rooms, a crowd of onlookers gathered outside. Soon the volunteer fire department arrived with buckets of water, and bystanders offered their assistance. Marie LaLaurie remained calm as she directed the volunteers to save expensive paintings and smaller pieces of furniture. But when neighbors tried to enter the slave quarters to make sure that everyone got out safely, Marie LaLaurie refused to give them the key. Enraged, they broke down the door and were horrified to find several slaves tortured and mutilated. Many of the victims said that they'd been held captive for months. The atrocities committed against the slaves in the LaLaurie home were extremely repulsive. Some were found chained to the walls, and others were suspended by their necks with their limbs stretched and torn. One female slave was wearing a spiked iron collar that forced her head into an upright position. Some slaves were nearly starved to death, beaten with whips, and bound in painful positions. Cruel experiments had been performed on some victims. This is extremely gruesome. Eyes were poked out, mouths were sewn shut, limbs were removed, and skulls were left open while they were still alive. The men who found the slaves were overwhelmed by the stench of death and decaying flesh, which filled the confined chamber. A local newspaper reported that the bodies of tortured slaves were found buried around the grounds of the mansion. When word of Marie LaLaurie noise coming from the abandoned structure. Several people said that they saw apparitions of the murdered slaves walking on the home's balconies, peering out of the windows, and roaming through the property's overgrown gardens. According to legend, those who entered the building were never seen again. The LaLaurie mansion was purchased in 1837, but the buyer put it back on the market after only 3 months, claiming to have been driven out by weird noises and anguished cries in the night. Hauntings continue. In the years that followed, the LaLaurie mansion was converted into a school for girls, abandoned again, and then converted into inexpensive apartments for immigrant workers. Time and time again, the restless spirits of the tortured slaves made their presence known, much to the horror of the people who lived there. Once, a terrified tenant claimed that the spirit of a naked slave in chains attacked him and then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Even cheap rent was not enough to convince tenants to stay for very long, and soon the house was vacant again. The LaLaurie mansion still stands today. Over the years, it has changed hands several times. It has served as a saloon, a furniture store, a shelter for poor and homeless men, and an apartment building. In April 2007, actor Nicolas Cage purchased the property, but just 2.5 years later, it was for sale again. There have been no reports of ghostly activity there in recent years, but that doesn't mean that the spirits of Marie LaLaurie's victims are resting in peace. That's really, really sad, actually. And it also says, final note, during a remodeling of the LaLaurie mansion some years ago, workers discovered several unmarked graves under the floorboards of the house. This may explain why many of Marie LaLaurie's slaves simply disappeared, never to be seen again. Yeah, that is quite a harrowing story, if you ask me. I believe I have one more. Just enough time for one more story. The story is called Testimony from the Other Side. When Zona Eastershoe of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, died suddenly at age 23, her doctor said she died of natural causes. But when Zona's mother encountered her ghost, a shocking tale of murder was revealed. Would testimony from the other side help to nab Zona's killer? Gone too soon. On January 23rd, 1897, a boy who was doing chores at the shoe home discovered Zona's body lying at the bottom of the stairs. He ran to tell her husband Edward, and then he went to get a doctor. When Dr. George W. Knapp arrived, Edward took him to the bedroom where he'd moved Zona's lifeless body. Although Edward had already dressed Zona for burial, Dr. Knapp examined her body. As the doctor went about his duties, Edward became noticeably distressed. As a result, Dr. Knapp cut the examination short. Because he didn't want to upset Edward any further, Dr. Knapp reported Zona's cause of death as everlasting faint. He later changed the finding to childbirth, even though Zona hadn't told anyone that she was pregnant. During his hasty examination, Dr. Knapp noticed a few bruises on Zona's neck, but quickly passed them off as unrelated. Sorry, there's some more background noise for the final story. Sorry about it. Whirlwind courtship. Not much is known about her life, but it is believed that Zona Easter was born in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, months after they met, Zona Heaster and Edward Shue married, but for reasons that she couldn't quite explain, Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, had taken an instant disliking to her son-in-law. Despite her concerns, the newlyweds seemed to get along until that tragic day when Zona was found dead. In an instant, Mary Jane's world was turned upside down. She grieved, as would any mother who must bury a child, but she strongly disagreed with Dr. Knapp's determination of her daughter's cause of death. In her mind, there was only one way that her daughter could have died at such a young age. She believed Edward Shue had killed Zona and had covered it up. Dun dun dun. It all comes out in the wash. At Zona's funeral, those who came to pay their respects noticed Edward's strange behavior. He openly mourned his wife's passing, but something seemed odd about the way he grieved. His mood switched between extreme sadness and sudden wild energy. He tended to his wife's body like a man possessed, allowing no one to get near it. He also tied a large scarf around his wife's neck for no apparent reason. And even stranger, he placed a pillow on one side of Zona's head and a rolled up cloth on the other. He told puzzled onlookers that they would help her rest easier. When Zona's body was moved to the cemetery for burial, several people noticed a strange looseness to her neck as they transported her. Not surprisingly, people began to talk. Mary Jane Heaster did not have to be convinced that Edward was acting suspiciously about Zona's death. She had always hated him and wished that her daughter had never married him. Seems like she should not have married him. She had a sneaking suspicion that something wasn't right, but she didn't know how to prove it. After the funeral, Mary Jane Heaster washed the sheet that had lined her daughter's coffin. To her horror, the water inside the basin turned red. Then, even more shockingly, the sheet turned pink and the water again turned clear. Convinced that this was a sign, Mary Jane began to pray that her daughter would come to her to reveal the truth. A few weeks later, her prayers were answered. Ghostly visions. According to Mary Jane, Zona's apparition came to her over the course of 4 nights. Zona described how abusive Edward had been throughout their marriage. She also stated that he was responsible for her death. The tragedy occurred because Edward thought that Zona hadn't cooked meat for supper. Men are evil. This sent him into a rage, and he strangled her and broke her neck. To demonstrate the brutality of Edward's attack, Zona's ghost rotated her head completely around. This horrified Mary Jane, but it also brought her some relief. Her beloved daughter had returned from the grave to seek the justice that she deserved. Armed with the power of a mother's love, Mary Jane was determined to avenge her daughter's death. Please believe me. Mary Jane immediately told local prosecutor John Alfred Preston of her ghostly visit and begged him to investigate. It is unclear whether or not he believed her story, but he agreed to interview Dr. Knapp and others connected to the case. When John Preston found out that Dr. Knapp's examination had been rushed and less than complete, he decided that an autopsy was needed to help clear things up. It was announced that Zona's body would be dug up. A local newspaper reported that Edward Shue vigorously complained about this, but was forced to witness the proceedings. When Dr. Knapp proclaimed that Zona's neck was indeed broken, charged with his wife's murder. While Edward awaited trial, tales of his wicked past started coming to light. It was revealed that he had been married twice before. His first marriage, to Ally Esteline Cutlip, had ended in divorce in 1889, while Edward was in jail for horse theft. In their divorce papers, Ally Cutlip claimed that Edward had frequently beaten her. In 1894, Edward married Lucy Ann Tritt, but the union was short-lived. Lucy died just 8 months into their marriage under mysterious circumstances. In the autumn of 1896, Edward moved to Greenbrier County, where he met Zona Easter. Was there a pattern of violence with this lethal ladies' man? Trial. Edward Shue's trial began on June 22nd, 1897. Both the defense and the prosecution did their best to discredit each other. For every witness who spoke of Edward's ill temper, another likened him to an altar boy. Edward was poised and charismatic on the stand. Then it was Mary Jane Easter's turn. When she was questioned by the prosecution, her ghostly encounter with her daughter was not mentioned. But when she was cross-examined by Edward's attorney, Mary Jane recalled in great detail how Zona's spirit had named Edward as her abuser and killer. The defense characterized Mary Jane's visions as little more than a grieving mother's ravings. They assumed that the jury would agree, but they were wrong. The jury quickly found Edward Shue guilty. Not only had they believed Mary Jane's supernatural tale, they fell just short of delivering the necessary votes to hang Edward Shue for his evil deeds. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison, and as it turned out, that wouldn't be very long. Conclusion. In July 1897, Edward Shue was transferred to the West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville, where he lived out the rest of his days. The convicted murderer died on March 13, 1900, of a disease that was spreading throughout the prison. But his name lives on, as does the ghostly legend of Zona Easter Shue. A historical marker located beside Route 60 in Greenbrier County reads, Greenbrier Ghost. Interred in nearby cemetery is Zona Easter Shue. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband Edward. Autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account. Edward, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to the state prison. Only known case in which testimony from ghost helped convict a murderer. Wow. Well, that is going